They called us land girls like it was something sweet. Like we were dainty farmhands with ribbons in our hair and songbirds on our shoulders. But there was nothing sweet about waking before the sun to haul sacks of grain heavier than your grief. And believe me, grief weighs plenty. I was 17 when war broke out. 18 when Charlie signed up. 19 when he was gone. No ceremony. No music. Just a knock on the door, a man with a letter, and the sound of my mother gasping like her breath had turned to glass. Charlie and I weren't married, not yet. But he'd given me a handkerchief with his initials stitched in the corner, and I'd made him promise to come home with stories. Instead, I got a folded flag and a name on a wall. I didn't cry right away. There were cows to feed. Fences to check. You don't have time for tears when the world won't stop spinning. But I remember waking up the next morning, walking out to the paddock, and staring at the gum tree where we carved our initials. C. W. plus G. W. Charlie White and Grace Wood. I stood there for what felt like hours, running my fingers along the bark. Then I turned around, went back inside, and signed the Land Army application that had been sitting on the table for a week. My mother tried to stop me. "You're not a farmer," she said. I wasn't a widow either, I answered. But life didn't ask me first. They sent me to a dairy farm in Victoria. Big country. Open skies. The kind of place where your thoughts echo louder than your voice. There were 7 of us girls, some from the city, some from places smaller than this. None of us had ever been away from home. None of us had any idea what we were walking into. We were greeted by a man named Bill who smelled like tobacco and rain. He looked us up and down, shook his head, and said, "Well, the cows won't care if you're wearing lipstick." Work started the next morning at 4:30 sharp. The milking shed was cold, dark, and smelled like damp hay and iron. By the end of the first week, I had blisters the size of 10-penny coins and arms that felt like lead. But I didn't stop. None of us did. We milked, shoveled, stitched, planted, lifted, repaired, and hauled. We changed oil, changed gears, changed tires. We helped birth calves and bury lambs. We cried behind sheds and laughed when no one was supposed to be laughing. Because if we didn't laugh, we'd break. Nights were quiet. No radios. No dancing. Just aching backs and bunk beds that creaked with every breath. We'd write letters, sometimes to families, sometimes to ghosts. I wrote to Charlie. Every Thursday night. I told him about the tractor I learned to drive. About the time Rosie got stuck knee-deep in mud. About the way the sky turned blood orange just before a storm. I never mailed them. But I kept every one in a biscuit tin under my bunk. Some of the girls called it healing. I didn't call it anything. I just worked. That winter, the frost came early. We lost 2 fields to it. One morning, Bill sliced his palm open trying to unjam a feed auger. There was blood everywhere. I grabbed a strip of linen, wrapped it around his hand, and said, "Don't be brave, Bill. Be still." He looked at me like he wasn't sure who I was anymore. Like maybe we'd stopped being girls and had become something else. Something solid. After the war, they stopped calling. The letters from headquarters dried up. The posters disappeared. The uniforms went back into storage. But I stayed. I wasn't ready to return to a life that no longer fit me. I wasn't ready to be the girl everyone expected to come home. Because she wasn't coming back. The grief had changed me. The work had shaped me. And slowly, the town started seeing us. Not just as land girls, but as women who had kept the soil turning while the world was burning. We weren't paraded. We weren't pinned with medals. But we were remembered, in fences that didn't fall, in harvests that weren't lost. And in the stories we whispered to each other when the lights went out. One night, Margaret asked, "Do you think they'll ever know what we gave up?" I said, "Probably not." She nodded. "Then we'll remember for them." And we did. The war was over. But the echoes weren't. They lived in the clatter of milk cans. In the slam of the stable door on a windy day. In the faces of the boys who never came back, their names now rusting on metal plaques outside courthouses. And for those of us who had carried the country on our backs while the men were gone, peace didn't feel like a parade. It felt like a question. Now what? Most of the other girls left after VJ Day. Some married. Some returned to offices or shops. A few simply disappeared, packed their cases and stepped into futures they hadn't dared to imagine while shoveling silage in the rain. But I stayed. Not because I was brave. Because I didn't know where else to go. The land had become part of me. The calluses weren't just on my hands anymore. They were under my ribs. In my voice. One morning, as I was mending a gate on the southern edge of the paddock, the postman rode up. "Letter for you," he said. I took it with dirty fingers, smudged it a little. It was a telegram. I hadn't received one since Charlie's death notice. My throat closed before I even opened it. But this time, it wasn't sorrow. It was confusion. Private Charles White. Recovered. Relocated. Hospitalized abroad. To return. I read it twice. 3 times. Then I sat down in the grass and forgot how to breathe. He was alive. Somewhere across the ocean, Charlie was alive. And everything I thought I had laid to rest came roaring back like thunder in my chest. Weeks passed like years. There were no follow-up letters. No phone calls. Just silence. I tried not to hope. Tried to keep milking cows, hauling hay, boiling tea like nothing had changed. But my hands shook when I tied knots. And I caught myself staring down the road too often. Then one afternoon, just as the sky was turning that dusty gold only Victoria knows how to make, I heard the truck. Not the milk truck. Not Bill Zuda. Something unfamiliar. I stepped out onto the porch. And there he was. Leaning on a cane. Hair shorter. Eyes deeper. But Charlie. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was real. I didn't run to him. Didn't cry. I just whispered. "You said you'd come home with stories." He smiled. A quiet, crooked smile. And said, "Turns out I brought a few more scars than tales." That night, we sat by the shed and said nothing for nearly an hour. Then he told me what had happened. He'd been wounded. Shell shock. Presumed dead. Records lost in a bombing. He'd spent nearly 2 years in a convalescent hospital, drifting in and out of memory, between then and now. I wasn't myself, he said. And I didn't want to be found if I wasn't whole. I reached for his hand. Held what was left of the boy I loved. And said, "You don't have to be whole. You just have to be here." The days after that were quiet. We didn't rush to get married. Didn't make big plans. Charlie moved into a small worker's cottage on the edge of the farm. Helped with light work. Mostly he walked. Watched the birds. Let the wind touch his face like it was telling him something he'd forgotten. And I kept working. Because that's what I did. One morning, Bill pulled me aside. "Sydney's looking for agricultural instructors," he said. "They want women. Real ones. Ones who've done the work, not just read books." I stared at him. "You want me to teach?" He shrugged. "Why not? You've run this place better than any man I've ever met." That night, I asked Charlie what he thought. He took a long sip of tea, then said, "Don't wait for the war to end inside you. Start the next thing. I'll still be here." So I went. Twice a week, I rode a borrowed motorbike into the city. Taught young women how to graft vines. How to rotate crops. How to listen to the land when the sky stopped speaking. They asked questions I didn't have scientific answers to. So I gave them real ones. Your hands will know before your head does. Cows don't care about your tears, but they'll stand still if you hum. Work boots don't lie. And somewhere in between lecture halls and hay bales, I realized I was no longer the girl waiting for a letter. I was someone others looked to for strength. And it scared me. But it also healed something. Because teaching is a kind of remembering. And remembering is how we forgive the past for not turning out how we dreamed. Years later, when Charlie and I finally married, it wasn't a grand affair. Just us. A borrowed dress. A small cake made of rationed sugar. And that same gum tree where we carved our names when we were children. I traced the faded letters with my fingertip. C, W, plus G, W. Time had warped the bark. But the marks were still there. Like us. Not perfect. Not untouched. But still standing. We didn't plan a grand life. Just mornings that began before the sun and nights that ended with sore hands and clean boots by the door. Charlie liked to say that happiness was a kettle that whistles before you ask it to. I said it was a fence that holds. Between the two of us, I suppose we were right most days. After the wedding, we took a small lease off the back of Bill's property, a sliver of hill, a strip of creek, enough flat ground to tempt the stubborn. We planted lucerne where the soil was loyal and oats where it pretended to be. I kept my 2 days a week in Sydney, teaching girls how to read weather by the smell of it. Charlie mended things, hinges, pumps, his own silences. He spoke more by seasons than sentences, longer on calm days, shorter in dry spells. But when he laughed, it came out like a bell you hadn't heard in a while, and you realized you'd missed the sound. Drought arrived like a rumor, then stayed like a relative. We learned the slow language of buckets and lists, which trees to save, which field to let go brown, when to open the creek gate, when to close it even if it felt cruel. I kept notes in a ledger, rainfall, calf births, seed prices, and in the margins, I wrote smaller things. Margaret wrote from Bendigo, baby boy. Schoolgirls in class asked if cows cry. Charlie fixed windmill with one spanner and swear. We got through that year by making plans we could keep. Small ones. Like, tomorrow we'll mend the trough, or Wednesday we eat the last jar of plums. A life is kept together by hand-sized promises. When the rain finally came, it didn't ask permission. It hammered the roof, bullied the gutters, turned the creek into a thoughtless thing. The lucerne drank like sailors on leave. The oats behaved as if they'd never considered dying. Charlie stood in it with his hat off, eyes closed, face tilted, lips moving. I don't know if he was praying or counting, maybe both. That spring, a girl from my class, name of Elsie, asked if she could see real work for a week. She arrived with soft hands and a notebook. Left with blisters and a grin. On her last day, I found her by the fence looking toward the hill where our gum tree stood sentry. What do you see? I asked. A life that fits, she said. Not many people get that. I thought of the telegram. The cane. The years we lost not knowing. Sometimes it takes a war, I said, to learn your own size. We didn't speak much about those missing years. Trauma is a skittish animal. If you chase it, it runs farther. So I let Charlie bring it to the yard at his own pace. Some evenings, he'd set 2 cups of tea on the step and tell a sliver, a hospital corridor, a nurse with kind hands, a man in the next bed who talked to his mother in his sleep. Then he'd go quiet, as if he'd opened a door to a room we couldn't furnish yet. I learned to leave the door ajar. Our farm was small enough to know by foot and big enough to worry about. We kept calves alive that had decided otherwise, learned which wire held in wind, when to listen to the old men in town and when to smile and do it our way. On Sundays, if we had strength, we walked to the gum tree and read the crooked letters we carved as children. C, W, plus G, W. The bark had thickened around them, as if the tree had decided our claim was harmless and permanent. One year, near harvest, Charlie fell from the back of the Uta, a silly tumbling accident that left his shoulder angry. He laughed it off because men were taught to. But the pain stayed, a dull echo. At night, his breath had a catch in it, like a boot tip on a step. I suggested a doctor. He deferred, then promised, then forgot to keep the promise. When he finally went, it was because he couldn't pretend anymore. The diagnosis arrived like hail on a hot day, sudden, mean, and over too quickly to grasp. The doctor spoke gently. Said some of it was old damage that had learned bad habits in his body. Said rest. Said treatment. Said good chances, and we've learned so much since, and don't borrow trouble. We didn't. Trouble paid rent anyway. Sickness has its own shifts, the morning round of pills, the noon broth, the small laugh when a magpie heckles your hat, the afternoon nap that cheats into evening. I moved my teaching to 1 day a week and brought home stories instead of homework. The girl who wired a fence straighter than any man, the boy who thanked me for teaching him to check the trough before it ran dry. Charlie liked those stories. They were proof the world had continued without asking for his permission, a relief to a man who'd once held back darkness with his hands. On the good days, he insisted on walking to the shed, just to smell oil and timber. On the bad, we sat by the window and counted clouds. A person can be measured by what they count: acres, debts, stars, steps, days. We counted days. He went in winter. The nurse said he left quietly, like a tide slipping, stubborn right up to the edge and then suddenly so gentle you doubt your eyes. I arrived 10 minutes after, carrying home marmalade from the church ladies because grief invites casseroles and jars. I laid the jar on the windowsill and sat down. The clock smiled its cruel smile. If you'd left earlier, if you'd driven faster, if time was something you could bargain with. We buried him under the hill where the creek curves, a place he liked to stand when the light went soft. After the service, men who'd never said more than "good rain" to me pressed my fingers and ran out of words. Margaret came from Bendigo with her boy. He had Charlie's sideways grin and the inattention of healthy children. He kicked dust at the grave and asked if Uncle Charlie would be plant food. His mother shushed him. I said yes. Then I told him that everything good is. That night, I slept with the window open and the kettle full. The house hadn't remembered how to be quiet yet. The farm looked at me like a question I'd already answered 100 times. Can you? Will you? Alone? Yes, yes, and yes, but not because I'm brave. Because the cows didn't stop chewing and the fences didn't stop wanting to fall. I sold nothing. I kept the lucerne. I fixed the windmill with 2 spanners and a story Charlie told me once about a stubborn screw. I hired Elsie for weekends. She arrived with her own gloves and a way of whistling that made the dog believe work was a game. We ran lean and right, cut the lists thinner, learned which corners could be left for later and which were load-bearing parts of a day. Grief became a season, not a sentence. Years stretched the way gum roots do, quiet, inevitable, deeper than you guess. The girls I'd taught sent notes, got the job, bought the place, had a daughter, named her Grace. You don't mind? I minded in the way that makes your heart open, the kind of ache that confirms you've been useful. One spring, the council asked about a plaque for the Women's Land Army. I wrote a letter with plain words and careful facts. I didn't ask for ceremony, we were never that sort. I asked for the truth in metal, that we kept food on tables while the world learned to count to peace again. They put the plaque near the showgrounds, where children lick sugar off their fingers and men argue about sheep as if it were philosophy. I went on a Tuesday when no one would fuss. Ran my fingers over names and years. The metal was warm. I said the quiet thank you say when no one is obliged to hear. On the 50th year since the end of the war, a local paper sent a boy with a camera to photograph the last of the land girls. He called me Miss Grace and asked me to stand by the gum tree, because photographs prefer symbols. I stood where bark had fattened our childish letters. The boy asked if we'd felt heroic back then. No, I said. We felt necessary. He looked at me like I'd given him the wrong answer. Perhaps I had. Perhaps the right answer is the one you can print in bold. But necessity is a quieter thing, it lasts longer than headlines. He took the picture anyway. I sent him home with a jar of marmalade. I grew old in the way paddocks do, edges frayed, middle strong. My knees told better weather than the radio, my hands read wire by touch. The house filled with useful ghosts, a hat on a nail, a cup left near the shed door, a coat that still believed in winter. I spoke to them less as time went, not because they'd left, but because I'd made room for other voices. The girls who learned, the men who softened, the children who believed cows cry and fences feel. Some nights, when sleep took its time, I'd open the biscuit tin and read a letter I never posted. The paper had thinned, the ink had learned to fade without apology. I didn't cry. Tears are not a currency you can spend twice on the same thing. I just read until the words stopped pretending they were needed. If you ask what remains, I could point, the fence line we set straight in a roaring wind, the field that still remembers when we forgave it for going brown, the creek that chose its own argument with the bank and won. But I think what remains is smaller and truer. A kettle that whistles before you ask. A fence that holds. A name carved in bark that a tree decided to carry. A life that fits, because you measured it with work instead of wishing. They called us land girls. We were women of weather and wire, of buckets and bomb, of laughter in the wrong places and silence in the right ones. We did not ask for medals. We asked for good boots, fair wages, and the decency of being believed when we said, "We can do it." The world pretended to hesitate, then let us prove it anyway. If you pass the showgrounds and see the plaque, give it a nod. If you walk by a paddock at dawn and smell hay and diesel and the very human attempt to wrestle a day into shape, say a quiet thank you. Not to me. To the ones who stayed when staying was the work. As for me, I wake before the sun most days out of habit more than need. I boil the kettle. I look toward the hill. The gum tree keeps its counsel. The initials keep their story. I step outside, and the ground remembers me by the sound of my feet. The world is loud again now. But under the noise, the old rhythm holds. Step, lift, mend, breathe. Love who you can. Carry what you must. Leave the fence better than you found it. That was our war. That is our peace.